And how, can I just get a sense, we have about an hour?
We have about 45 minutes, an hour, if we're really interested.
Okay. If you get less interested, tell me, and then we can cut it short.
I will. All right. So, Stephen, welcome back to Wellington, New Zealand. And interestingly, I was musing on the fact before getting here that you would have first been heard in this room about 15, 18, maybe 20 years ago, which was a recorded talk, downloaded probably over 20 minutes it would have taken on a 56K modem, and played to the Wellington Insight group here. Oh, way back when. So you in this room, the four walls here will be familiar with your voice.
Yes, good, okay.
So
thank you.
Tonight, welcome to One Mindful Breath. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say about whether the Dharma and whether Buddhism gets in the way of the Dharma, I think is what you're talking about. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Ramsey, very much indeed. It's always a wonderful pleasure to be in Wellington. 1 minute, I just got to go shut my windows or we'll get noise. Thank you, Ramsey. It's always nice to be back in Wellington, even when you're in France. And I don't really need to give any preamble, but let's just go straight into the topic. The title I suggested was, Does Buddhism get in the way of practicing the Dharma? And my answer is, yes, it does, badly. And I'd like to try and explain to you what I mean by that. Those of you who are familiar with my work will know that I have railed against the doctrines of karma and rebirth and different realms of existence for a very long time. And I've got somewhat of a reputation of being a bit of an iconoclast on these topics, which has both had its good and its bad consequences. But I think that kind of reservation about Buddhism, that in order to be a Buddhist, you have to believe in karma, you have to believe in rebirth, you have to believe that you could get reborn as a poodle. That's actually only scratching the surface. I think the problem goes far deeper than that. I think it is quite clear that we could dispense with these Indian cosmological theories and this Indian worldview that might have been a perfectly adequate framework in the 5th century BC India. But nonetheless, we could do away with that, karma, rebirth, and we still are left with enough material from Buddhism that can give us the basis for a really meaningful practice, ethic, and so on. And so it would appear that doctrines like the Four Noble Truths, the Three Marks of Existence, and so forth and so on, are completely untouched by the removal of karma and rebirth. Actually, I don't think they are. I think that they're part of the problem too. I think the problem goes much deeper. The problem effectively being that of how the Dharma, which to me is a pragmatic and therapeutic ethic, became a religion with all manner of doctrines and dogmas and priestly hierarchies and so on. And in order to somehow remove the over-religious nature of Buddhism, and get back to the Dharma requires, I think, rather more radical surgery than just, taking out overtly Indian aspects of cosmology and so on. We have really, I think, to let go of the Four Noble Truths. And that is a much more challenging proposition for your average Buddhist. These are doctrines that are very sacred for many people, and I certainly don't want to upset people by dismissing them. But nonetheless, I think that they are, that the Four Noble Truths doctrine does in fact imply rebirth and karma. Very simply because if you believe that suffering, the first noble truth, which is sickness, aging, death, and so on, if you believe that the origin or the cause of that is craving, hello there, new visitor in Miramar. Nice to meet you, little boy. Hope you're well. I've lost my train of thought now. If we believe that craving is the cause of suffering, which is a very, very central Buddhist belief, then we have to believe that craving is the cause of birth and sickness and aging and death, because that is clearly how the Buddha described suffering. Once we're there, then we don't really have much option but to accept the idea of rebirth, because what causes birth and sickness and aging in the end is the craving, which creates the karma that gets you reborn. One way round this problem is to psychologize the whole thing and to do what we find in a lot of the mindfulness world, and namely to say that, well, what craving is not the cause of birth, sickness, aging, and death, but craving is the cause of the unnecessary mental anguish we suffer when we get old and when we get sick and so on. In other words, it reduces the whole practice of the Dharma to just basically getting into learning how to become more detached, more aware, more mindful, more present, and then you won't suffer as much from aging and sickness as you might once have done. And I think that waters down the whole. I think that is true, by the way. I think that is actually very true. But I think it waters down the entire reach of the Dharma, which is not about just making your mind a more comfortable place to be, but it's about coming to terms with birth, sickness, aging, and death. I think this is absolutely central if the Dharma is to be a fully engaged existential commitment to life on earth. It's not just about tampering with your mind. It's about rethinking the very purpose of what your life is for. So, in other words, the Four Noble Truths I don't think of as just another alternative to what I would prefer to call the Four Tasks. In a sort of a nice, polite, liberal setting, we might just think of these as two different ways of looking at the same material. One version, the tasks, will suit some people, truths will suit another. I think that's not the case. I think we have to be quite prepared to jettison the Four Noble Truths altogether and try to rebuild a practice and an ethic of the Dharma on the basis of the Four Tasks. Now, recently I was sent, as I often am, a manuscript of a book. The author wanted there to be a blurb from me on the back, which will no doubt catapult sales into millions and millions of copies. Of course, it doesn't work like that. And this was a book written by someone who presents himself as a secular Buddhist and has written a very basic introduction to Buddhism. But unfortunately, this book, again, doesn't let go of the notion of the Four Noble Truths. It doesn't let go of the basic sort of standard teachings you find in Buddhism. Makes reference to the Four Tasks, makes reference to my work, but basically is still speaking the old language. And for this reason, I'm unable now really to endorse such books. Not that they're wrong. In fact, the book is probably quite accurate, but it's still a question of presenting Buddhism in the way in which it has traditionally been understood and with a kind of secular gloss. That to me doesn't work. I've had a similar problem in a thought experiment that I sometimes ask myself, namely, if I were invited to give a talk, not to a bunch of people like you, but let's say to a group of undergraduates in a university in a religious studies department. I was invited as an expert on Buddhism and someone who was going to explain what Buddhism was all about. what would I do? I would find myself with a bit of a dilemma. I could present Buddhism as it's traditionally understood and as, the way you'll find it in most books on the topic. And then I would have to qualify by saying, well, actually, I don't believe in these Four Noble Truths. I think we should look at it this way. I don't think I'd be doing those students a service, and I don't think I'd be doing myself a service if I were to do that. I'm not interested in being an expert on Buddhism. I'm not interested in presenting in a kind of academic way what Buddhism is. I'm interested in trying to communicate what the practice of the Dharma means for someone living today and who takes these values and this ethic and these practices with utmost seriousness. So I would feel very compromised in being in a setting like that, a university department, having to talk about Buddhism. I prefer not to do it, frankly. If I were invited to talk about just my own work, that would be one thing. But I don't any longer feel I can really, in good faith, stand on a platform or sit on a chair like this and talk about Buddhism. Can't do it anymore. I think I'm having to leave Buddhism behind. Now, what I mean by Buddhism is the religion, is the traditional doctrines of that religion, and all of the structures of power and authority that have grown up around it or are basically built into it, namely monasticism to a large degree. I also don't believe anymore in the three marks of being. In other words, that all conditioned things are impermanent and all conditioned things are suffering and all things are without self, which is another Buddhist dogma. And again, it's basically making a metaphysical claim. It's saying anything that has been caused will pass away, will be dukkha, painful in some respects, and will be without self or not be something that is not self. Again, that's a metaphysical claim. I don't have any access to all conditioned things. Maybe there's conditioned things somewhere in the universe that don't follow those rules. Who knows? To make that sort of claim that this is the way things really are, a phrase that likewise reverberates through the Buddhist community. If you quieten your mind and you let go of your thoughts, you will see things as they really are. This is a very dangerous track to go down. It's also a mistranslation of the original term, but that's another story. The fact is, most Buddhists trot this out endlessly, that mind becomes still, mind becomes clear, and you see things as they really are. Really? As they really are? How do we know? How do we know how things really are? The Buddha, as I understand it, presented these features of experience, impermanence, dukkha, and not self, not as ontological truth claims, this is the way things really are, but simply as pointers and guidelines which have a purely pragmatic purpose. In other words, it's useful to pay attention to change. It's useful to pay attention to dukkha, to suffering. It's useful to pay attention to how experience is not essentially me or mine. Those things are useful attitudes, useful perspectives that might help free us up to live better. That's all that matters. It doesn't matter whether they are the nature of reality or not. And in any case, how would we know? So again, I think even doctrines like that, which sound very secular in a way, which sound somehow compatible with science, are nonetheless metaphysical truth claims. They're basically making statements about things which are not evident to us. And I don't think we could ever really know that. So it's not, I'm not dismissing these ideas, impermanence, etc., but I think we need to treat them and think about them in a very different way, and to let go of the idea that they somehow pin us into reality itself. I think we can almost dispense with the idea of reality. I don't think the Buddha was remotely interested in the nature of reality. Now, I realize that the way I'm speaking now to some of you might appear a bit strange. It might appear a bit odd, but it really is no different from how William James, for example, thought about these things. We have a strong pragmatic tradition in the West that goes back to the late 19th century, which seeks to do away with the whole idea of truth. The whole idea of truth as reality. In other words, that language corresponds to some reality, that the real truth of things somehow is out there somewhere waiting to be discovered. Again, that is a very well established form of human thought, but frankly, it's shot through with problems. I'm not going to get into the philosophy here. We can discuss that later if you wish. But the point is that as long as we as long as we ascribe to the Four Noble Truths or the three marks of existence, we're effectively ascribing to a view of the world that I feel gets in the way of practicing the Dharma. I think it is still expecting of a kind of metaphysical commitment to see the world and to see ourselves as conforming to a certain description that we seem to find in the Buddhist text. I think we can let go of all of that. It's not really necessary anymore. And I do think in doing so, we actually get much closer to what the Dharma is about. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Dharma is for me pragmatic, therapeutic, skeptical, and effectively an ethic, a way of being, a way of flourishing as individuals and communities in this world. Which brings us to another aspect of Buddhism I think we have to politely remove, and that is this inbuilt deference to monks and nuns. The idea that somehow if you are to take your practice of the Dharma with utmost seriousness, then whether you become such or not, the best way to practice would be as a monastic, to renounce the world, and have no domestic life, to depend upon alms, to be celibate, and to follow all of these rules and so on. And that is the optimal condition for the practitioner of the Dharma. Now, particularly when you're in Theravada Buddhism, or Tibetan Buddhism too, but Theravada Buddhism particularly, this is a non-negotiable position that you are expected to hold. Again, I don't think it's necessary. In fact, I think it gets in the way. The kind of person that I aspire to be, and that is how I would think of how we should think about ethics. In other words, ethics is not just following rules, which would be simple morality, but ethics really is how do I live my life in a way in which I flourish fully. Then we need images and examples that of a fully flourishing life in this world that is compatible and speaks to our condition today. And that is not a shaven-headed monk leading a detached life of an alms mendicant. I've got nothing against individual monks. In fact, many of my friends are monks. I support them in what they do. I've got no problem with monasticism per se. In fact, I think it can be an excellent training, as I myself experienced. But I don't accept any longer that the monastic is somehow a model of what an ideal practitioner should be. I think that's a big problem. And whether we hold that view implicitly or explicitly, I think it gets in the way of the practice of Dharma, because the model we have, the model of, we may have a photograph of a monk-type person in our altar or whatever, it is unconsciously perpetuating the idea that as long as we are in this world as lay people, then somehow our practice is at best second best. That, again, this is something I can no longer accept at all. And yet I find myself, when I'm in the presence of monks, when I visit a monastery or go to a temple, I find myself slipping back into deference. I bow, I go through all the motions, I treat these people differently. It's a habit that's very deeply ingrained in me. And there's a part of me that feels quite comfortable with that. But I feel that if we are to really imagine and bring forth a secular Dharma, then we have to get rid of those habits as well. And we need, I think, to be able to no longer assume the monk has somehow got some privileged spiritual potential that we lack. We have to let go of that. Now, for those of you who have read my books and so on, you're probably familiar with some of these ideas already. But I would like to go back to these early source texts to just to remind us that we do in fact find in the earliest discourses passages that support this kind of secular Dharma approach. It's not just an attempt of someone coming out of modernity like me, trying to read these texts in a way that suits my preferences. I think we can actually find some very sound bases in these early discourses to give us a really good basis for this kind of approach. And one of these texts is the parable of the city, where the Buddha describes himself as a person who's gone into a forest, who has found an ancient path, who has followed the ancient path. It's led to the ruins of an ancient city. Then he goes out of the forest, goes to the king, encourages the king to rebuild the city. The king does that. And then the city once more is prosperous and full of people and so on and so forth. And when the Buddha explains this parable, he says that the ancient path in the forest is the Eightfold Path. And the city itself is effectively the Dharma, but not the Dharma as a doctrine, but the Dharma as a living community of people who are working and reproducing and enjoying themselves and having the joy and the security of living in a city. So this really sits quite uncomfortably with the standard account in Buddhism of the Eightfold Path, for example, which says the Eightfold Path which leads to the end of suffering. It doesn't say the Eightfold Path which leads to the rebuilding of a city, which is what this parable suggests very strongly. There's an indicator here that the Dharma at the outset was basically a cultural and civilizational movement, not the beginnings of a new religion. That's, of course, what it became, and I think it became that quite quickly after the Buddha's death. But at the origins, I think we have some fairly good basis for seeing the Dharma as a way of acculturation, of civilization, rather than the promotion of a religion and beliefs and doctrines and monks and so forth and so on. And that's what I'd like to get back to. And I'd like to conclude this presentation with some reflections that I've been pursuing recently about the Eightfold Path itself. Now, again, I will assume, I think there is very good evidence for this, that the Eightfold Path is something that goes back to the Buddha himself and that is probably utterly central to his original teaching. We can say that the Eightfold Path is the alpha and the omega of the Dharma. And I mean that quite literally. It's the very first thing he announced in what is supposed to have been his first discourse. He says, I have found a middle way, and that middle way is the Noble Eightfold Path. And then at the very end of his life, when he's lying on his deathbed in Kusinara, he's asked, when you're dead, how do we know that a teaching is yours rather than something someone else has made up in your name? And he says, if it contains the doctrine of the Eightfold Path, if it teaches the Eightfold Path, you can trust it. Now, this has led me to look at each of the terms are used in the Eightfold Path. In Pali, that is Ditti, we translate as vision. Sankapu, we translate as intention or a thought. Vacha, we translate as speech. Kamanta, we translate as action. Ajiva we translate as livelihood. Vayama we translate as effort. Sati, mindfulness. Samadhi, concentration, or I would prefer collectedness. This is so basic, way you might be wondering why I'm even mentioning it. But if you look carefully at those 8 terms, you'll find that there are some anomalies. Now, there are 2 anomalies that I'm going to point out now. And again, we don't have time to go this in great detail. But the anomalies are found in the 2nd step of the Eightfold Path and in the 4th step. In other words, what is usually translated as right intention and right action. Okay, now, right intention, sometimes translated right thought, is a translation of the word sankappa. Now, the problem here is that, or the anomaly here, is that there are perfectly good words in Pali, Sanskrit, Tibetan, Chinese, for intention, which is cetana, it's not sankappa. And there's a perfectly good word in Pali for thought, which is vitakka, not sankappa. The word used in the Eightfold Path is sankappa. Now, what does sankappa mean? Sankappa is a word that's hardly used elsewhere in the discourses. It only really occurs in the context of the Eightfold Path. But what does it mean? It comes from it's rooted in the Pali word kapeti. And kapeti means to organize, to build, to construct, to prepare. In other words, the kinds of things you would have to do if you were going to be building a city, for example. To organize, to build, to construct, to prepare, to fit things together. This is what kapiti means. It doesn't mean intention, it doesn't mean thought at all. It means to construct something, to build something, to organize something. This is, for me, getting close to what we might in English translate as imagination. In other words, if you have a vision of the world and you wish to live ethically in the world, you are called upon to imagine another kind of society, another kind of person you could be. And in this way, you prepare, you begin to organize and build and construct a community, for example, or even something more grandiose, a center or whatever. But you're building something, constructing something, organizing something. And that might include intentions, obviously, thoughts, but the concept is really rather different. And for some reason, this kind of got forgotten, that this is the original meaning of the word sankappa. So I'm translating this now as imagination. Again, that may not be the best translation, but it's the one I'm working with at the moment. I think it's certainly better than intention and thought. So we have vision, imagination, and that then leads to speech, right speech. And then the 4th of these terms is invariably translated as right action. But that's not what the word in Pali means. The word for action in Pali is kamma, or karma in Sanskrit, but that's not what the Eightfold Path list gives. It gives another word, kamanta. Now, karma is the same as in karma, action, but kamanta means occupation, career, or work. Now remember, this is the 4th one, not the 5th one, that's livelihood. What the Buddha's doing here is kind of curious. The word kamanta in no way ever in the Pali texts means simply right action. If you remember the passage where the Buddha as a young boy remembers he's sitting beneath a rose apple tree and his father, the Sakyan, was at his work, his kamanta. And then the young man entered into a state of meditation and so on. In other words, kamanta means work. And it's given a very central place on in this Eightfold Path that is different from the next step, the 5th step, ajiva, which is usually translated as livelihood. And that usually gets compounded with work, livelihood. They're thought of as the same. But in the Eightfold Path, the two things are different. There is work, and then there is ajiva, which I think means something like what we do in order to survive. Ajiva means literally for life. Very similar to the English word survive, or überleben in German, or survivre, which means to keep living, to keep on being alive. And this points to me that, well, there's a number of questions. Why, when the word kamanta so clearly means work, is it not translated or not understood as that in the tradition? And I think it's because monks don't work in that sense. They don't have kamanta. But if a monk is regarded as the ideal Buddhist practitioner, then the monk surely must be one who practices the Eightfold Path, which means that that person needs to practice kamanta, work, occupation, career. But clearly monks don't do that. So they turned it, this is my hypothesis, I might be wrong, so they've interpreted kamanta not to mean work, but basically to avoid killing and stealing and abusing. In other words, to apply, appropriate physical morals in your life. In other words, with your body to act in the right way. That's not what the term means. I think what's going on here, in both of these cases, Sankappa and Kamanta, is that they've been given a monastic twist. They've been turned into, in a sense, subjective morals. Right intention has to do largely with your motivation. Again, if you look at the way that Samasankara is often defined, the first thing they say is it refers to renunciation. Again, a typically monastic activity. It privileges that. And it loses any connection at all with building, organizing, constructing, fitting things, getting things to work. Kamanta too has been turned into, good bodily moral conduct rather than work. Now, if we think of the Eightfold Path really as a framework for human flourishing, which is the phrase I would use, then it means that our practice is one of which engages our imagination, which engages our work. The way we work in the world is the way in which we enable ourselves to flourish as persons and flourish as communities. Work is a good thing. It's not something to be renounced in favor of sitting on a mountain and meditating. But we go back to this very early source, and we find a much more positive valuation of work than we do in the way Buddhism has traditionally interpreted it. So again, I think Buddhism is getting in the way of the Dharma. Buddhism has built a superstructure on a lot of these early ideas that conveniently endorses the lifestyle of monks, but in doing so actually entails a level of distortion in the reading of certain key terms. So that's just a couple of examples. I hope that this presentation has made sense to you, and I hope you're not picking up that I'm just some ranting old man. But I feel very passionately about these things, and I feel that Buddhism, the Dharma is too important in many ways to leave to the Buddhists. The Buddhists have got too many other vested interests. And another thing that's really got on my goat recently is the way in which some of these monks behave. And look at what they're doing in Burma, in Thailand, in Sri Lanka. Buddhist monks are spearheading campaigns of persecution on racist and ethnic grounds. I don't really have any interest in identifying with that community. Of course, there are many good monks, wonderful people in all of these countries. One must be careful not to forget that. But as institutions and as functions of the nation state, I think they have become profoundly corrupted. And I think we need to distance ourselves completely from that lifestyle and start afresh with both a return to these early sources, but more importantly, an engagement with the world we actually live in such a way that we try to inculcate and embed these values in contemporary life. Okay, I spoke for about 40 minutes. I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
I suggest that if a question.
Yeah.
Hello, it's Philip.
Hi, Philip.
There's a lot of material here. The term that comes to my mind that intrigued me was that I became aware of was a term called religification. And it's
Religification, yeah.
Religification. It's a term that meant that made a lot of what you're suggesting that's not just applicable to Buddhism, as you may be arguing. It also applies to probably other traditions, religious, and probably other political movements as well. So it's probably just a natural structure is what happens when power takes over on a structure. Are you familiar with this term, religification?
Religification. I'm certainly familiar with the idea. I'm not sure I would actually use that term. I'm not even sure. I suppose it exists. But yes, what you say is exactly right. Yes, I completely agree. And I also think it's important to notice that religification, if that's the word, is not a problem just for religions. It's a problem, I would say, in politics, very much. That it seems to be a deeply seated human tendency to want to kind of freeze and achieve a kind of closure. In other words, let's take Marx, for example. Marx wrote, he was an economist, basically, and a political theorist. And his writings are very dynamic, full of, energy and vitality. And yet, very quickly, when Marxists get hold of it, it slips into yet another doctrine, yet another dogma, yet another priesthood. Look at the Jungians. Jung was a brilliant thinker, psychologist, and yet it too, his doctrines got taken over by Jungianism, by Jungians, and Freudians got hold of Freud, and Christians got hold of Jesus, and the Buddhists got hold of the Buddha. And a similar process occurred in each time, in each instance, is that something that was creative, imaginative, dynamic, fluid, responsive, became something fixed. Krishnamurti used to tell a story about God and the devil. He says God and the devil were walking down the road, and one day God said to the devil, "Oh, look over there. There's the truth. I found the truth." And the devil says, "Oh, give it to me. I'll organize it for you." And that is the problem.
Hello, Stephen. Martin here.
Hello, Martin.
That's a great segue. I became involved through knowing Krishnamurti and spending a lot of time in medical research with him in the mid-70s.
Mm-hmm.
And my question really relates to that, is that one of the things that Kay said back then was that, I agree with everything you said, by the way, is that the danger is in Buddhism or Christianity or whatever, that you have a model and the model gets in the way of the experience. And so if we take as an assumption that there is the experience came first, however one wants to define it, as a flowering of consciousness, a change of consciousness, which the Buddha experienced, then Buddhism since then has got three elements, and it's the third element I really want to ask your opinion on. The first might be what we just talked as the church, which wants to own the gateway to that experience. We all share perhaps the same views on that. The second is that it's a roadmap. It offers a roadmap towards the experience. And modern neurophysiology suggests that the brain now operates in a predictive way. And therefore, the more you create a model, the more you create a barrier to the experience. Because if the model is in any way a metaphor, it's impossible to use it as a pathway. But the third element, and this is the one I really wanted to have your feelings on, is that Buddhism offers orientation.
Sorry, offers?
Orientation.
I didn't hear that. Invitation?
Orientation.
Oh, orientation, right. Okay.
Now, what I mean by that is that if one accepts that there is an experience to be had, a change of consciousness, one of the things that I think Buddhism does is create a language for orientation for somebody who's within that that process of experience to be looked after and understand what's happening to them. So one of my, I'm very comfortable with the first two being thrown out. With secular Buddhism or secular approach to the Dharma, I think we all have to find a way to put together a process of orientation and support that, if it doesn't utilize the language of these metaphors.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the I've thought along these lines myself. I think the key thing is actually providing a framework of orientation. And I think the Dharma does that. And Buddhism does it too. But Buddhism does it in a way that is often at the service of certain vested interests. And for example, it's... To me, the orientation element is perhaps most powerfully articulated, not in the doctrines of Buddhism, but in the metaphors and parables that the Buddha used. And I think there's an enormous genius of the Buddha, and with Christ, it's similar, to come up with incredibly powerful metaphors. The city is one. The idea of the raft is another. There's many, even the idea of the path, the Eightfold Path, that is a metaphor. It's saying that this practice is like a path and it includes these elements. And those all provide us with an orientation, but the advantage of focusing not so much on doctrine, but on metaphor and parable, is that metaphor and parable stimulate and awaken the imagination. In other words, if I give you the story of the city that I did, each one of you in the room will have your own little pictures and associations going on. Whereas if I gave you a doctrinal or psychological explanation of the Dharma, it would be much, much narrower. You'd reduce everything just to, concepts of mind and so forth, which could be very helpful, but then less oriented than these very powerful metaphors. The parable of the poisoned arrow. Poisoning the arrow. There's many, and biblical scholars have helped us understand the presence of parable and metaphor is usually an indication that that is a teaching that goes back to a very early period. What happens in the development of a religion, or we might say what happens in the movement from the Dharma as the Dharma becomes Buddhism, is the metaphors and the parables become less, and the doctrines and the theories become more. So for orientation, which is crucial, and the Dharma to me is primarily about framework that helped me orient my life. A set of values, a set of practices, a set of concepts that gives me kind of guideline pointers to how to live and flourish as a human person. I think the real question, for me at least, even though we might be aware of that, even Krishnamurti was aware of that, how do we actually, can we ever ensure that no matter what approach we come up with, it will not become subjected to the same, let's say, constrict tendency? And you see Krishnamurti too, weirdly. The Krishnamurti, again, having denounced gurus and so forth in no uncertain terms, ends up basically being a guru, and his teachings basically become a kind of a doctrine. And I'll never remember, I'll never forget a time I saw him in Zan in Switzerland, this was in the mid-70s, when I lived in Switzerland as a monk. And a couple of times to hear Krishnamurti speak. And in one occasion in Switzerland, at the end of his talk, someone in the audience said, "But my guru this, my guru that," which is like a red flag to a book. Then Krishnamurti stood up on stage, and he was 90 years old, not in good shape at all. And he says, "Sir, you must never surrender your authority to another person." Now, this is very authoritarian, presumably. But he's basically delivering some kind of, Torah dictate that he's warning against. And I find that very strange. On the one hand, I find it strange. On the other hand, I think it's very human. That's what humans do, this stuff. And I think what this points to, really, is like what Trotsky suggests, the permanent revolution. In other words, we can never be complacent with any particular solution we might come up with. Let's say that solution is secular. That too is just as prone to get caught up in this stuff as anything else. The church, the Buddhist church, and I'll be not a priest, okay? The same problem. Can we imagine a way of life, a way of thinking, a way of being, which we have an inbuilt self-destruct mechanism, so that as soon as this kind of thinking kicks in, it'll be defueled? I'm not personally totally optimistic about that, given what we know about human beings. But I do think it's extremely important, and for this I'm enormously grateful to Krishnamurti, to keep that, to be aware of it, to keep it alive in mind.
Thank you.
So thank you. Anyone else? Well, come on.
Hi.
Keep getting more. I know you so well. What is your name? Dale? No.
Ladane, Derek. Yes. So, firstly, can I ask the other people, if the speakers are on, can you turn them off? Because we think that might be degrading the bandwidth. Stephen, your image has been frozen for some time. We can't see you move. There's no animation. And I'm not even sure that you can hear me now.
I don't know what happened there. Can you hear me? See me?
I can hear you, and you're moving again. Well, sometimes moving.
Something crashed. Okay. It says my internet connection is on.
I think it's a bit better. So Duncan's and Suzanne's speakers are both off. So
it's the video you want to turn off. Duncan and Suzanne's video.
Well, let's just try it as it is. What I wanted to say was two things. Firstly, a comment. Listening to, I was reminded of the old thing about two kinds of speakers. There's lumpers and splitters. And in terms of all the different manifestations of the Dharma that have frozen into religions, which I would call Buddhisms, because they're kind of different around the world and through time. And you've called them Buddhism, as if they're one.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of an observation. But it brings me to the second thing, which is, and of course what your project is, and not you only, this is a project I support too. We've just lost Stephen. And you're back.
I'm back. This is clearly not a stable connection.
Not a stable.
Anyway, continue and then I'll reply, but then we'll have to, I think, close down. And we seem to have lost from the Isle of Wight.
Yes.
Oh no, there she is. Hi, Sis.
She's waving. Okay. It's unstable. We'll persevere. We'll stop soon. So what we've got is Buddhisms, but what, and this is the bit that's interesting, what gets thrown up, what gets retrieved out of those religions every so often is Dharma manifestations. In the modern world, we have things like Vipassana in Japan, things like Soka Gakkai, and those all seem to me pretty much lay movements. They abandon the kind of monastic framework, they abandon a lot of their, I don't want to judge them, I just want to sort of point to them as examples of attempt to retrieve the ethic, the Dharma from the ontology of Buddhism, from the crystallized religion. They keep on throwing up, and your project is another part of those.
Another attempt to do the same thing.
So that turned out to be comments. I'm just interested in your observations on that.
Yeah, well, I've thought a lot about all of the things that you have said. It's certainly true that the word Buddhism is misleading because there are many variants of, there are Buddhisms, and this is a point that's often made. And I think, you know, for convenience, I say Buddhism, but basically I agree with you. I think we shouldn't lump them all together as though they were indistinguishable. They're clearly not. And one of the great richnesses of Buddhism, in a way, is the fact that it is very good at reinventing itself in different circumstances. And so you get Zen, you get Theravada, you get modern day Vipassana, and it shows a kind of a fluidity and a flexibility that is really what enables Buddhism to survive. Buddhism is not tied to an ethnic identity like Hinduism. It's not tied to a sacred text like the Quran. It's much more flexible and fluid in many ways. But the examples you give, the Vipassana community, in, let's say, in the West, and particularly in the US and Europe, the Soka Gakkai, reformed Japanese movement starting in the 1920s, I would argue that neither of these have gone nearly far enough. They've largely they've overhauled the superstructure. That's for sure. They've largely dispensed with monks, although again they have some sort of token reverence for them, and they've taken out some of the more abstruse doctrines that have inherited by Buddhism, but they haven't really, either of them, really questioned some of the core problems that I would identify, particularly the notion of the Four Noble Truths, the notion of a basic metaphysical underpinning, a worldview as the nature of reality. And with Soka Gakkai, they still believe karma, rebirth, all of that stuff is normal for them. So they actually haven't gone very far at all. And they've actually introduced something that's frankly rather dubious, you know, chanting the name of the Lotus Sutra in Sino-Japanese. That to me is kind of bizarre, really, and it doesn't really make an awful lot of sense. But it benefits people, there's no question of that. So I'm actually arguing for something rather more radical, and not just retooling of an existing tradition, which is effectively, I mean, the Vipassana movement is basically a reformed Burmese Theravada Buddhism. Soka Gakkai is a reformed Nichiren Shoshu lay off. These are relatively light reform movements. I think we need to get back and rewrite the operating system, the DNA, get back to the real DNA of the Dharma. And in one of my essays, I talk about coming up with Buddhism 2.0 and leaving behind Buddhism 1.0. Vipassana, Soka Gakkai are still Buddhism 1.0. They haven't really rethought the structural underpinnings of their thinking and practice. So a secular Dharma, I don't like, I'm moving away from the word secular Buddhism now. I think Buddhism is a lost cause in many ways. I think we can dispense with that word and just try to recover and to amplify the sense of the term Dharma. But it's a work in progress, and it'll always be a work in progress, I suspect.
Yes.
Okay, I think I have to go. Actually, I've got a busy day ahead of me.
Thank you.
Can we wrap here?
Yeah.
Ramsey.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
And thank you everybody for coming along here, and thank you for Duncan, and thank you Suzanne. Good to see you both.
Yes, wonderful.
We have recorded this, and at some point it should be up on the One Mindful Breath website and on YouTube. So be really interesting.
Excellent. Okay.
Thank you, Stephen. We will be
Good.
at some point.
All right.
Okay.
Keep well. You're at the end of your day, aren't you?
We are indeed. It is 9 o'clock in the evening.
Okay. Good night.
Bye
See you
bye.
soon.